Although I don't typically do videos like this on the channel that much anymore, stuff like ranking games or, the Beards and Cars podcast in a general sense where we used to talk about a lot of this kind of stuff, like predictions for the future, I'll be honest, a lot of the reason why I don't do stuff like that much is not only because the YouTube algorithm has been complete garbage this year and probably will continue to be, but also I just don't kind of feel that whimsy as much that I used to have for Gran Turismo. Remember the days when we actually used to think that Polyphony cared what the community wanted? I just don't really get that impression as much anymore, at least not when it comes to stuff like adding vehicles that we like. Just look at the leaked list. Those cars were clearly already planned long before we had even had the chance to ask for them, so those videos just don't feel quite as, I don't know, they're not as fun anymore to me as they used to be. But I do think it's an appropriate time, given how long we've had Gran Turismo 7 for and how long we've been able to ruminate on our thoughts for games like that, and of course all of the previous ones, to revisit the idea of ranking all of the Gran Turismo titles. Now I will be lumping some together, and you'll see why in just a second, and that only applies to my 10th place pick. So, of course, down in the comments, I want to see your rankings. You could rank it in whatever way you want. You could base it on which games you think were the most important, which ones you think were the best all-round experience, or it could just be which ones were your personal favourite to play. All of those are valid. For me, so that you can understand where my rankings fall, I'm combining it between my experience with the game, but also, to temper that, which game I believe had the best, more objective all-round experience. So not just which one did I enjoy the most, but which one still holds up, which one had amazing features for its time, for its console, and which still holds up today for that. So then, to jump into it with 10th place, I'm lumping a whole bunch of games in together, and I'm calling this one Prologues, HDs, Concepts, all of that. I'm putting all of those together in 10th place because they almost don't really qualify as games in the entire series or franchise in my opinion at all. They're more like high-end demos, which is why I'm putting it at the bottom of the list. If you took these away from the series, very little would change, aside from having a little bit more of an exclusive collection for certain players who are completionists or a bit of an early access peek at the game. They really serve no long-term purpose when it comes to the main games. So to me, they just don't really have the longevity. There are a couple of unique vehicles, but nothing special enough to make them rank higher. So for me, that's number 10. Number 9 will definitely be controversial for some people, but this one definitely combines the idea of how well it holds up and definitely with my personal experience with it, and that is GT Sport. Number 9 is GT Sport for me, and it's for two primary reasons. Number 1, I did not enjoy the game all that much when I was playing it, and the vast majority of time that I did spend playing it was exclusively because of catering to YouTube. If I were not making YouTube videos, I would have stopped playing it much sooner. And secondly, and to me this really does kill it as far as ranking any higher on the list, there is no replayability whatsoever for me with GT Sport. And I'm sure there are some players, I'm certain, because there always are, there are some players who will go back and maybe still do go back to play GT Sport even now. But I feel like for many of us, I can't think of anything particularly special about GT Sport that you can't just get in GT7 now anyway. In some ways, GT7 kind of feels like GT Sport 2, or GT Sport with a different title and a bigger car list. To me, that's the nail in the coffin because it was less fun at the time and there's no reason to go back to it, and those two are pretty big nails in the coffin for me at least. Number 8 for me is one which is only this low because of course I didn't play it when it first came out. I've never actually fully played through it even to this day. However, it is very culturally significant, so even though I've played it less than the ones below it, I'm still ranking it higher because of its significance, and that is of course Gran Turismo 1, or just Gran Turismo as it was called at the time. Of course, massively important. You could argue the single most important. None of the others would have happened if you want to look at it that way. For me though, I can't rank it higher because I haven't fully experienced the game, I've never fully played through it, and I don't have the kind of connection that some players do. So for me, most of its position here is out of respect and because of its legacy, but not so much because of personal experience. Speaking of personal experience, and definitely when it comes to replayability, and certainly The reason why this one ranks above Gran Turismo 1 for me on my personal list is because of specifically what it can do on the console that you can play it on. Gran Turismo Portable, for me, is my number 7, GTPSP. I feel like this is probably, along with stuff like Prologues and Concepts, one of the games which, if you are a player and you haven't played certain games, this is probably, or at least more likely, to be one of the Gran Turismo games that you probably haven't played. It's one of the ones that's easy to skip over. It's not necessarily an essential one to play. It's essentially a game which fits between Gran Turismo 4 and 5, has elements of both, also has a very similar vibe to Tourist Trophy in many ways. The reason, again, why I'm ranking it relatively high in 7 compared to the ones below it is because A, it is outstanding for its console. On the PlayStation Portable, it's a serious bit of kit and has a colossal amount of vehicles alone, let alone all the circuits, surprisingly good graphics for a console and age of its time. And although it doesn't have as enjoyable of a career mode as most of the others on the list, not all of them, but most of the others, the amount of cars, the amount of tracks, the easy pick up and play fun factor that the game has, coupled with the fact that you don't earn money all that quickly, which means it actually does feel like you're working towards something when you buy a more expensive vehicle, plus that the vehicles rotate quite a lot in the dealerships, it actually means that the game does have quite a lot of time wasting factor. You know, if you're on a longer journey, maybe you're on a plane, you can jump back into it, grind some cash, and actually buy vehicles which aren't even in the games anymore. Much like Gran Turismo 4 and others at the time, it's a nice nostalgia hit. It's very impressive for its console, great for its age, it's a bit more niche, and let's be honest, it's the only one that you can play on the go, really, unless you have some kind of optimized gaming laptop with, you know, a version of Gran Turismo on it. For me, in number 6 is a game which would have been probably lower were the list only about which ones I love the most, but I'm placing it higher than I would have on that list because of, again, its significance, how well it holds up, and also I have to account for how much the community enjoys it as well, and that is Gran Turismo 3. I know that many of you have a huge amount of love for Gran Turismo 3, and 6 is pretty respectable. It's around the midpoint, which is higher than I would typically put Gran Turismo 3. I did enjoy it at the time, and one of the reasons why I think it is at least worthy of 6, if not higher, is because it was the first Gran Turismo game on the PS2. I mean, we may have had a prologue or something before that, but I mean the first, mainstream Gran Turismo title. It was certainly the first one that I played on the PS2, and having previously already played Gran Turismo 2 as a kid before this, it was an incredible step up. The physics, of course, on the new console, the graphics in particular, were such a radical difference. Like most Gran Turismo titles on a new console, it did unfortunately pare back the content, in particular way less cars, and also not just less cars, but a lot less interesting and standout cars compared to Gran Turismo 2. They'd lost a lot of the wacky stuff and played it a bit more safe with a lot of the vehicles that they chose to be in that game. Although, of course, it did feature some incredible debuts, such as Formula cars, which became more of a part of the franchise, and probably most notably, the Mazda 787B, which of course was the first time that we saw that in Gran Turismo in a mainstream game, and what an incredible debut that was, given how legendary it is. For me, Gran Turismo 3 did not quite appeal to me as much at the time, but it does have massive cultural significance. I think it holds up very well for a very, very early PlayStation 2 game. It was a fantastic upgrade in terms of hardware and software from Gran Turismo 1 and 2, and it did debut a couple of legendary things which did either make a standout for me in that game, or in the case of something like a Mazda 787B, really enjoyed much further on. For me, one of the things that I do love about Gran Turismo 3 was Complex String. To this day, it's one of my favourite tracks in the whole series, and as far as I can recall, I think it might have been the only game that featured it. It might have been in a prologue or something like that, but not that I can recall. Next up, we break into the top 5. So this is where things really get interesting. And this one's definitely going to annoy some people, and I would wager probably people who have started playing more recently, because my number 5 pick is Gran Turismo 7. And some of you may be surprised that it's even that high on the list, but to me Gran Turismo 7 is not a bad game. To me, Gran Turismo 7 is the classic case of the meme of the dad saying, "I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed." Gran Turismo 7 doesn't necessarily anger me at this point, I'm beyond being angry. And it kind of goes back to what I said about GT Sport and even making these kinds of videos. I feel jaded, to be honest, about Gran Turismo at this point, and that is not something I want to feel, but I do. The fact that Gran Turismo 7 feels so much like a GT Sport 2 and so strangely shallow for a game that has so much more potential. And it's a game which definitely, for me at least, does not live up to its trailers. The trailers were hand-picked and very clearly crafted to appeal to those of us who miss the old experience. It had cars coming back, tracks coming back, the vibe coming back of older games like 4, 5 and 6. But then it just didn't deliver on that. It has virtually no career mode in a traditional sense. It has a weird structure which is clearly still very much geared toward the online aspect, even in terms of being able to save the game. And although the online aspect is great and it's good fun, for those of us who want an actual, game to just play on our own, like Gran Turismo literally always used to be, well, it doesn't really cater to us very much at all. We really do feel like an afterthought. So for those who enjoy the online stuff, this is where opinions will definitely drastically split. If it didn't already split for GT Sport, you'll probably lose me, or I'll lose you even here, because I'm sure for those who do love online and esports and all that kind of stuff, you probably love the game, because you won't care about the other things much anyway, which is, of course, where the personal aspect of the list comes into play for me. The reason why I'm putting it in 5th is because it does have a lot of potential. As you'd expect, it has the best graphics of any game in the series. Of course, it's the one that we're still playing, it's still getting support, still getting updates, but I feel like there is a huge amount of squandered potential with Gran Turismo 7. And I'm not talking about pie-in-the-sky stuff, I'm just talking about making it a game that felt more complete at launch, a lot of things that were very clearly held back, not because they needed to be, but because, well, I mean, as I've said before, it gives the illusion of having more content over time, but it's actually just the content that you could have had from day one in many cases that becomes drip-fed to create the illusion of having more. There are plenty of people who disagree with that, and, ultimately, who knows or cares? It's an argument that could go on forever. That's my perspective, I know it's the perspective of many others as well, and regardless of whether or not that's true, it's certainly the impression that the game gives off at the very least, even if it isn't true. So for me, it's a very mixed bag. Of course, I still produce content for it on the channel because it's the current game, so of course I do. But again, if I were not making content for YouTube, I would definitely be one of those people who only looks up the trailer each month and only logs in if I like the look of the update. That would literally be it. And that's not just a Gran Turismo thing. I find that with a lot of games recently. I don't even play Forza Horizon 5 anymore, and I haven't played it for probably the best part of a year because I was only logging in to get, seasonals and new cars. It's the exact same problem. And it's become almost like this self-cannibalizing thing with racing games where they are so geared toward the online aspect that they're just pretty much forgetting the main core of a game without the online experience. And I guess those of us, myself included, who miss that must be in the minority, because plenty of people seem to be defending it. So maybe it's just that we're getting too old for this, but whatever the case may be, again, it's my personal list and my personal experience, so that's how I have to say it. For me, next up in number 4, this one could be controversial, but I've seen an interesting thing happen with this pick because it's definitely been one that has switched up back and forth. This was a game which had a huge amount of hype, myself included. It's where the channel literally got its start when I started really taking things seriously back in the potato can days. But at the same time, it was a game which disappointed many people, mostly because of its career mode. It's a game which then had a very long life, I guess you could say. It had some updates, but the game itself had a lot of content and a lot of potential. Some probably don't think it delivered on it, others maybe do. The online aspect was very well handled, in my opinion. It certainly endured far more in terms of keeping me interested than for some reason Sport Wars 7 have, and that is, of course, GT6. Gran Turismo 6, as I've said before on the channel many times, will always have a special place for me because it's where I started making videos that ultimately would become Hammer Studios Gaming, as it was called back then. That's not even what the channel stands for anymore. I renamed it in honour of my dad, Hamer Stephen George, but before the channel became HSG Automotive, back when it was Hammer Studios Gaming, it was where, as I said, things got started. The potato camera, sat on a stack of VHS tapes recording the TV with my reflection and a microphone that didn't even pick up my voice properly, but that's where things got started, back when I had 76 subscribers, hence the reason why that's the racing number on the channel today. And since then, well, we are where we are now, getting started with stuff like Speed Tunes and various other series that became legendary on the channel, like Spirit of Le Mans and various others that I know some of you still remember from as long ago as that. Gran Turismo 6 to me has also seen a definite resurgence in interest, because now if I make car reviews for GT6, they get, on some occasions, the same amount of views that Gran Turismo 7 car videos get. And I've seen a lot of resurging love from people who actually miss it. I know that there are some servers that are still up for Gran Turismo 6, private servers, but I believe, and certainly for me, I feel that if Polyphony ever did open up the servers en masse for Gran Turismo 6, I can tell you for a fact I'll be playing that game a hell of a lot more than Gran Turismo 7 or Sport, that's for sure. And to me that speaks volumes to how well it has actually held up. I don't know if that says more about how good Gran Turismo 6 was, or how disappointing Sport and 7 has been, or maybe some combination of both. But overall, it definitely has a special place for me. I think it holds up very well in terms of fun, and in terms of just sheer vehicles, it is the biggest game we've had in the entire series, over 1,200 vehicles. For me, in third place, it's where my journey began. Of course, I still have a huge amount of love for this one. It's the game which had not only some of the wackiest cars of the whole series, but still some of the most legendary cars of the series. Stuff like, of course, my personal favourite car from Gran Turismo, period, the Renault Espace F1, the Lotus Elise GT1, the Saleen SR, the Chrysler Phaeton, so many wacky vehicles, even a first generation TVR Speed 12, the Tommy Kyra ZZ2 in its weird alternate sketch form, the Tom's Angel, so many weird cars, and that is of course Gran Turismo 2. Legendary game for me, absolutely one of my favourites regardless of its longevity, regardless of how well it holds up. Of course any PlayStation 1 game is going to look very dated these days, but to me the fact that Gran Turismo 2 has had recent mods made for it shows that clearly I'm not the only one who loves and misses this era of Gran Turismo and who still can play it to this day and have so much fun with it. I know that many love Gran Turismo 1 and 2. For me, 2 will always have the advantage because, as I said, it's where my story started, and it really is, I believe, where some of the core foundations of my love for cars to this day got started. Stuff like Unsung Heroes. I think it was a very formative game for me, and one which, to this day, if you were going to remaster any of the games, I think has such massive potential. I mean, if you imagine Gran Turismo 2 with Gran Turismo 7 graphics and physics, that would be one hell of a game. We move up then into second place, and some of you who know me well, or at least who have been watching the channel for long enough, might think you already know what 1 and 2 are going to be, or at least the order they're going to be in. But actually it might surprise you, because this list, as I said, is not only my favourites, it's also about how well the game holds up, and also, crucially, what the game offers overall. And because of that caveat, in second place, I'm actually going to put my personal favourite of the franchise, Gran Turismo 4. Gran Turismo 4 is by far my favourite Gran Turismo game. I think it holds up astoundingly well, given that it was on a PlayStation 2, but some of the car models look so good for its time that even as far as Gran Turismo 6, years later, the best part of a decade later, on a completely new console, some of the models still looked like the models used from Gran Turismo 4. Some of the most legendary circuits come from that game. Some of the circuits that we're even wanting back now, like your El Capitans and Seattle and New York and various other tracks that are legitimately legendary, are from that. Even many of the vibes of Gran Turismo that many of us love really came into their own in a game like 4. The concept of moving around a very realised world map style menu, which had been featured before but in a very 2D way. Gran Turismo 4 was when that became 3D, looking over an atlas. The feeling of euphoria and the, what some would call probably snobby vibe that Gran Turismo has become known for really did begin in 4, with the operatic music and the heavenly tones and of course the moon over the castle. It's where it all came together, and to me the fact that it has 700 cars, however many circuits, a colossal career mode with actual 24-hour races for the first time in the series, incredible challenging events with genuinely difficult AI, especially for me as a teenager in my early teens at the time. Stuff like the final championship to win the Mercedes Sauber C9 in the Formula 1 series. The driving missions, many of us know those legendary missions to this day. Mission 34 with the SLR McLaren, the notorious, at least for me, Slipstream Skyline mission, which took me way too long as a kid to complete because I didn't understand what I was doing, didn't know what Slipstream was, but god damn it, I wanted that Jay Leno tank car bad enough and I just kept doing it until I won it. Rally events which actually hold up pretty well overall, and of course just an overall vibe that really does encapsulate what Gran Turismo is kind of all about, at least for many of us. However, my number one pick, which is pretty obvious now that we've talked about everything else, is the one that I think I have to place in number one, because as much as I love 4, and certainly for me 4 has more replayability than my number one pick, I kind of have to admit that if I combine my personal love and personal experience, but more importantly with how remarkable it was for its time, its console, and crucially where so many things came together in such an unarguably excellent way, I think I have to say that in my opinion at least, the overall best Gran Turismo game that has been made so far is Gran Turismo 5. Because even though I didn't play Gran Turismo 5 when it first came out, so I don't have quite the level of love that many people do, it's probably one of the main reasons why 4 is my personal favourite over 5, I do still have the respect and the hindsight to see A, that it was phenomenal for its time, it's fantastic for its console on the PS3, and also the fact that it is 9/10 as big as Gran Turismo 6 in terms of vehicles. It has a combination of many of the older school picks that we love with a lot of the new stuff coming in. It's where Ferrari finally became a part of the series and so many others as well. The return of stuff like actual proper visual mods in some cases. Rally events are treated probably with the most respect actually out of any Gran Turismo game, with actual rally stages for a change. The fact that career mode is split up into 2 huge portions with one completely dedicated to director's mode, which is crazy to think of now, and even in any game prior to that it was just a kind of an afterthought or an option that came in handy for 24-hour races. But in that game they gave it so much time and so much respect. The fact that you could have drivers who had become better over time. In fact, more love was put into that than any other Gran Turismo game ever did. Of course, its graphics were phenomenal. Another massive step up from the already fantastic Gran Turismo 4. A lot of the iconic music, a lot of the iconic memories. But for me, there are 2 things in particular that make Gran Turismo 5 have to be my number one. One of those things to me is the fact that it is the only Gran Turismo title to debut on a new console, but wherein polyphony did not use it as an excuse to make the game smaller. Gran Turismo 5 was the first game in the major games of the series to be on a new console, but simultaneously bigger than the previous game. When Gran Turismo migrated to the PlayStation 2, GT3 was a smaller game than 2. Then, when it happened more recently on the PlayStation 4, 5, Gran Turismo 7, well, I guess technically you could say it's a bigger game, but it was also on the PS4, so it's more like a crossover era. Sport was a hell of a lot smaller than 6, if you really want to count the PS4 crossover era, whereas with Gran Turismo 5 they didn't do that. Gran Turismo 5 was legitimately bigger in every way, and with significantly better physics and graphics, and a number of other things than 4, and they didn't use it as an excuse to slow down, pare back, shove it all into updates to milk the game's lifespan. They just made a genuinely better game than, everything that had come before it, personal preference aside. Secondly, I think that the fact that as much as I love games like 2 and 4, it's kind of unarguable that, in particular for its age and for its console, the graphics and physics on GT5 hold up outstandingly well. With the other games, they have a charm due to their age, and due to, of course, nostalgia, which causes you to forgive a lot of things. Gran Turismo 5, you honestly don't really have to forgive anything. It just legitimately still looks great. Of course, it's not as good as Sport or 7, but that's not a fair comparison. For its age, though, it still looks fantastic. It doesn't give you eye bleed or, make it a horrific game to look at. It still looks great, and it still feels great. The physics feel right on that pivot point between the charming older arcadey side and the more modern, taking itself more serious side. And again, another massive thing, probably the single biggest thing in its favour. And in some ways, one of the things that caused the downfall of the later games, in my opinion, is that GT5 was really where the online aspect of the Gran Turismo experience became a thing. So if you think of it that way, Gran Turismo 5 really was a nexus point for having a legitimate single-player career, a legitimate online aspect, and a legitimate director's mode all within one title. The fact that those three are together on one game for its age as a debut on that new console, and that was still bigger and better in virtually every way than the games that came before it, are one of the core reasons why, apparently unlike many people, with Sport and 7 in particular, I do not give Polyphony the leeway of saying, well, it's a new console, of course they have to pare things back, things take longer to develop. Sure they do, but they've proven before that they can step up their game, and they didn't use excuses. And you could say, well, pairing up to the PS4 or the PS5 is so much more of a task than pairing from the PS1 to the PS2 or the PS2 to the PS3. That is exactly what people at the time would have said about doing that. Of course it's more difficult now. Times have changed. The point is, back then, Polyphony was a company that didn't accept the idea even of not having the game be fantastic when it inevitably finally came out, because they were pretty much always delayed. But when it did come out, it felt like a game. It didn't feel like 60% of a game. It didn't feel like a game with a promise attached to it. It didn't feel like a game which you then fully assemble like a Meccano set later on. It was a game, and then anything after that was a bonus. That is how a game is supposed to be. We live in an era where we have accepted, at least some people have, that is fine not to be like that anymore. I will never accept that. I have to work with it, but it doesn't mean I like it. I certainly do not recommend it. I do not think it's a better way of doing gaming, and I will never let up on critiquing and criticising Polyphony for doing that, because it is lazy. It is exactly what every other developer is doing, and as other games like the vitriol that Baldur's Gate 3 is receiving because other developers don't want to up their games, so they're trying to hate on that game, I'm sick of the excuses. If you find a game too difficult to make on a new console, boo-hoo. You chose to make it. You want to make the money, make the product, and make it to a good enough standard that we don't need to hear your excuses. Gran Turismo, as I've said before, and Polyphony are not your friend. Kaz does not know who you are. He doesn't care, and he never will. Polyphony don't know who you are. You are a customer, you're a number on a spreadsheet of a profit margin of a particular fiscal year. That is all you will ever be. So stop trying to defend companies who do not care about you. I hold the standard to these games because they have proven that they can do better. So I will never condone them doing the lazy route, which in my opinion they are doing now, of drip feeding content for whoever's decision that was. I don't think Kaz necessarily had the final say on that, although of course he has a big say as the director of the game. And I will not condone how games in general are being approached these days, let alone Gran Turismo. But the fact that everyone is doing something doesn't make it right. That is an excuse. Baldur's Gate is the other example of that, a prime one. And other games have proven, even those that didn't quite hit the mark but still tried, like the Outer Worlds challenging the failure of Fallout 76. These are shining lights in the darkness of laziness that is being portrayed, and for me that is another core reason why Gran Turismo 5 is my number one. Not only was it massively impressive for its time, not only was it the pivot point in the series between the old and the new, but it also proved that just because it's on a new console with new graphics, updated physics, and a much bigger task and much bigger challenge for the people who built it, they didn't use it as an excuse to let up on making it the best thing they could at the time. And to me that has to make it number one, because as sad as I am to say it, I think Gran Turismo 5 may always be the best overall Gran Turismo game we ever have, because we may not ever get back to that kind of point again. I'm sure there will be plenty of people, plenty of mindless drone fanboys who don't like even the thought of criticising polyphony, and that's fine. Stay blind, I really don't care. Ultimately though, that's it for my ranking of my list, and of course, tell me yours down below. And like I said at the start of the video, I'd love to see where you rank it, but I'm actually more curious to see why you rank it. Why, in your opinion, is a particular game in the series number 1, number 2, etc. So of course, let's have some discussions down below. I'd say keep it civil, but this is Gran Turismo and fandom, so of course it won't always be. But I hope you enjoyed this ranking. Of course, tell me if you did or didn't. I know you will, and I'll see you next time for more. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.